My son lifted his wine glass at his own dinner table, in front of his wife's parents and his new boss, and said, "Mom's little craft thing keeps her busy. We're hoping she'll wind it down before it gets embarrassing." The whole table did that polite, breathy laugh people do when the powerful person in the room has decided to be funny. I didn't argue. I didn't set down my fork. I smiled at Ashley's mother, told her the roast was lovely, and reached for the bread. 40 seconds later, my phone rang on the table between us, the screen face up where everyone could read it, and the name on it was the one person in this state whose call could turn that whole laughing room to stone. I let it ring twice. Then I picked it up, and I said, "Hello, Priya," and I watched my son's face begin, very slowly, to understand that he had just mocked the most valuable thing our family owned in front of every person he'd been trying to impress. By the time I set the phone back down, the laughing had stopped, and my son Trevor was the quietest man in the room. Here's what my little craft thing actually was, and what happened when the family finally found out what it was worth. Welcome back to her calm revenge, where the work they call a cute little hobby is usually the only thing in the room that will outlast them all. Stay with me to the end. Drop a comment, tell me where you're listening from, and be sure to subscribe. My name is Faye Carter. I'm 66 years old, and for 31 years I have made things with my hands. Quilts, mostly. Heirloom quilts, hand-stitched. The kind that take a season to finish and a lifetime to wear out. Embroidered linens. Hand-loomed throws in colours. I mix myself from the wool up. I started at my own kitchen table the winter. My daughter was small, sewing to keep my hands busy, and a little money coming in. And somewhere across 3 decades, that kitchen table grew into a workshop, and the workshop grew into a business, and the business grew into something that, well, I'll get to what it grew into. That's rather the whole point of the story. I know fabric the way some people know music. I can tell you what a thing is worth by how it's made, by the tightness of a seam and the honesty of a corner. And I learned a long time ago that the worth of a handmade thing has very little to do with whether the people looking at it know how to see it. Most people don't. They look at a quilt and see a blanket. They look at a woman my age with a needle and see a sweet old hobbyist filling her empty hours. My son looked at me for 34 years and saw exactly that. A mother with a cute little pastime, harmless, a touch embarrassing, something to be managed gently and eventually retired. I let him think it. I'll tell you why, because it matters for everything that comes after. I learnt a long time ago that being underestimated is its own kind of quiet power. People say things in front of a woman they've decided is harmless, that they would never say if they thought she was someone. My son said a great many things in front of me. So did his wife. They both assumed the woman at the end of the table with the reading glasses and the pincushion was simply glad to be invited. I was listening to every word, and I was writing some of them down. Let me tell you about Hal first, because none of this makes sense without Hal. My husband died 4 years before that dinner. 40 years of marriage, and then a heart that simply stopped on an ordinary Sunday while he was reading the paper, and then a house that went very quiet. Hal was not a craftsman. He couldn't sew a button. But Hal was the one who turned my hobby into a business, and he did it not with a grand gesture, but with 100 small, stubborn insistences. The kind of foresight that isn't magic, it's just paying attention to a person you love and refusing to let the world make her small. It was Hal who looked at the shoebox where I kept my cash from the church craft fairs and said, "Faye, this isn't pin money anymore. This is a business. Let's treat it like one." It was Hal who drove me to the county office to register the name Carter and Hearth, because he said my work deserved a name that sounded like it would still be there in 50 years. It was Hal who sat me down with a young accountant named Marcus and made me open a separate account, keep clean books, pay myself a real wage. Price it like it's worth something, he used to say, and people will believe you because you'll be telling the truth. It was Hal who, when a boutique in the city first asked to carry 6 of my quilts, said, "Don't you dare sell them $1 cheap to be liked." You let them pay what the work costs. And it was Hal, 2 years before he died, who insisted over my protests that it was silly, that I was just a woman with a sewing machine, that we trademark the Carter and Hearth name and pattern marks properly with a lawyer, so that the thing I'd built carried my name and no one could ever lift it out from under me. I thought he was being grand. I understand now he was being careful. Hal couldn't see the future any more than the rest of us. But he'd watched our son grow into a man who measured everything by what it looked like to other people. And he'd watched the women that son admired. And I think Hal knew the way you know weather coming, that someday I might need to be able to prove, on paper, exactly what my hands were worth. He spent some of his last good energy making sure I could. Price it like it's worth something, Faye. That was Hal. He was telling me the truth about myself, slowly, for years, so that one day I'd be able to tell it back to a room that didn't want to hear it. So by the time of that dinner, here is what my little craft thing actually was, though no one at the table knew it. Carter and Hearth was a registered company with a trademarked name and 4 people on its payroll besides me, 2 long-time stitchers, a young woman who ran the website, and Marcus part-time on the books. I owned the workshop outright, a converted brick storefront on Lyle Street that I'd bought with Hal 11 years ago and paid off in 7. My quilts were carried in 9 stores across 3 states. There was a waiting list. And the one person whose name had been on my ringing phone, Priya Anand, owned Marigold House, the most respected home and lifestyle store in the city, the kind written up in the glossy magazines, and Priya had spent the last 2 months quietly putting together the thing that call was about. I'll make you wait for it the way my son had to. But know this, going in, my craft thing was worth more than my son's salary, his leased cars, and the down payment on the house he was so proud of, combined. He just couldn't see it, because it came in the shape of a woman with a thimble, and he'd been taught his whole life that worth comes in the shape of a logo. I need to be fair to Trevor, because the part of this that aches isn't the cruelty, it's that I raised it. My son is not a stupid man, and he's not, at his core, an evil one. He is a frightened one, and fear, in a grown man, often looks exactly like contempt. Trevor spent his childhood watching me work, and somewhere in his 20s, he decided that the work embarrassed him, that a mother who sewed for a living was a mother he had to explain. He married Ashley, whose family measures everything in the way her mother measures it, by the label and the address and the right sort of friends, and Trevor wanted so badly to belong to that world that he began, a little at a time, to treat the woman who'd raised him as a liability to be smoothed over. I don't think he set out to be cruel. I think he set out to be accepted, and I was the price he'd quietly agreed to pay. And Ashley, I don't want to make her a cartoon, because the truth is sadder than a cartoon. Ashley grew up being taught that the worst thing a person can be is common, and that a woman's value is the impression she makes. She looked at my workshop, the way you'd look at a thrift store you'd wandered into by accident, with a polite, faint distaste. She wasn't outright unkind to me. She just looked through me, the way you look through the help, and she'd been very gently working on Trevor for years, I think, on the subject of his embarrassing mother and her embarrassing little business, until the contempt that came out of his mouth at that table was as much hers as his. I should tell you about the one good thing in that family too, because she matters, their daughter. My granddaughter, Emma, who was 10 that year and who is the reason I can tell this story without bitterness. Emma loved the workshop the way Trevor never had. She'd come on Saturdays and sit at the little table I kept for her and learn running stitch with her tongue poking out the corner of her mouth. Exactly the way her grandfather used to concentrate. She called the workshop the magic place. She was the only person in that family who had ever once asked me how a quilt was made instead of how much it sold for. Remember, Emma. She's where this whole story was always going, though I didn't fully know it yet myself. Let me take you to how the dinner came to be, because the cruelty didn't come out of nowhere. There'd been 100 small cuts before the big one. For about 2 years before that night, Trevor had been gently, persistently, campaigning for me to wind down the business. It always came dressed as concern. Mom, you're 66. You should be relaxing, not running a company. Mom, that neighborhood on Lyle Street isn't what it was. You really ought to sell that building while it's worth something. Mum, don't you think it's time to slow down? People worry. People worry. It took me longer than it should have to hear what was underneath all that concern, because I wanted to believe my son was worried about my knees and my hours, and not about my balance sheet. But Hal had taught me to read what's underneath, and underneath was this. Trevor and Ashley were drowning, quietly, in the way people drown when they've decided to look richer than they are. The house Trevor was so proud of had a mortgage that ate him alive. The cars were leased. Ashley's family set a pace the two of them could not actually afford, and they'd been keeping up on credit and on fumes. And Trevor had looked around, the way frightened people do, for the nearest thing big enough to keep him afloat, and what he'd found was his widowed mother, who owned a paid-off building on Lyle Street and a house free and clear, and a fat, foolish little hobby. He was sure he could talk her into liquidating. He wanted me to sell the workshop. That was the real campaign. Sell the building, wind down the silly business, free up the money and the part he never said out loud. But I came to understand. Let some of that money flow his way. Because what's a mother's money for if not to rescue her son from the consequences of pretending to be rich? He'd already, I learned later, told Ashley's parents that I was in the process of retiring from my little craft venture because a mother with an embarrassing storefront didn't fit the picture, but a mother quietly being managed towards selling off her assets that he could live with. The dinner was Ashley's idea, which should have been my first clue, because Ashley does not invite me to things. It was billed as a celebration. Trevor had a new boss, a regional director named Glenn, and Ashley's parents were in town. And somebody decided it would be lovely to have everyone together, and somebody decided, for reasons I should have questioned, that I should be there too. I think now I was invited as a kind of test to be displayed, gently, as a problem that was being handled. The old hobbyist mother, almost retired, nothing to see here. They had no idea what was about to ring on the table between the bread and the roast. I drove over with a hostess gift. A hand-embroidered set of napkins I'd made myself, the linen ones, with the small wheat pattern in the corner. I want you to hold on to that detail, because it's the saddest part of the night for me. I arrived happy. I brought my work into that house with both hands and a full heart, glad to give it, the way I always am. I had no idea I was walking into a room that had already decided my life's work was a punchline. Ashley's mother, Diane, took the napkins, held them by one corner, the way you'd hold something to check it for stains, said, "Oh, how quaint," and set them on a side table. And I watched her decide they would never touch her table. I let it go. I'd learned to let those go. Glenn, the new boss, was pleasant enough. A big, hearty man who shook my hand too hard. Ashley's father talked about his golf club. Trevor refilled wine glasses and laughed too loudly at everything Glenn said. And I watched my son perform a version of himself for these people, a smooth, prosperous, unembarrassing version, and I understood with a small ache that I was the one rough seam he was hoping no one would notice. We sat. The roast came out. The conversation turned, as it does, to what everyone did. And Glenn, being friendly, turned to me and asked, "And what about you, Faye? Trevor tells me you keep busy." And there it was, the opening. I opened my mouth to answer. I was going to say, simply and truly, that I ran a textiles company, but Trevor got there first. Trevor, who could not bear for his mother to be a textiles company in front of his boss, jumped in with a little laugh and said the words, "I will hear for the rest of my life. Mom's got this little craft thing," he said, "quilts and such. It's adorable, honestly. Keeps her out of trouble." A ripple of indulgent laughter. He warmed to it, the way people do when a room is laughing. We're actually trying to get her to wind it down before it gets embarrassing. You know how it is at a certain point the sewing circle stuff starts to look a little… Ah, he waggled his hand. Sad, the gesture meant. A little sad. Ashley smiled into her wine. Diane murmured, "Bless her heart." Glenn chuckled, not unkindly, because he didn't know any better. He was only following the lead of the man who was supposed to know his own mother. I felt the room go small around me, that old, familiar feeling of being made tiny in a space full of people who've decided you don't count. I have felt it before. I felt it the way you feel a draft. And I'll be honest with you, because there's no use pretending otherwise, it landed. After 31 years, after Hal, after the building and the payroll and the waiting list, to have my own son hold my life's work up by 2 fingers in front of strangers and call it a little craft thing. He was trying to get me to give up before it got embarrassing. It landed. And then my phone rang. If you've ever sat at a table and had your life's work, the thing you made with your own hands, the thing you poured your years into, held up and laughed at by people who decided long ago that you weren't worth taking seriously, then you know the particular silence that opens up inside you in that moment. It isn't rage. Rage is loud, and it makes mistakes. It's something quieter and far more dangerous to the people who caused it. If you know that silence, stay with me, because this is exactly where it turns. And if you believe a person's life work deserves to be measured by what it is, and not by who's embarrassed by it, hit subscribe, so the next chapter finds you. The phone was on the table, face up, because I'm a woman who runs a business and I keep my phone where I can see it. The screen lit. Priya Anand Marigold House. And every person at that table could read it, because it was right there between the breadbasket and the gravy. I want you to understand who Priya is, so you understand what happened to the air in that room. Priya Anand is not a craft fair friend. Priya Anand owns Marigold House, and in this city, if you know anything about anything, you know Marigold House. It's the store the magazines photograph. It's where the people Ashley's mother wants to be friends with actually shop. Diane's whole face had a relationship with the name Marigold House, and I watched her register it on my phone screen with a flicker of confusion. Because what on earth would Marigold House want with the quaint old woman and her napkins? I let it ring twice. I am not above a little theatre. Hal would have laughed at me. Then I picked it up, and I did not leave the table, and I did not turn the volume down, and I said, "Hello, Priya." And Priya, who has a carrying voice and was excited and had no idea she was on display, said, warm and clear enough that half the table could hear it, "Faye." I'm sorry to call it dinner, but I couldn't wait until Monday. Hartwell said yes. They said yes to all of it. Faye. They want the full Carter and Hearth line in 40 stores. They want the exclusive holiday collection, and the licensing number came back even higher than we pitched. I've got the paperwork drafted. We are going to make your quilts a household name. Are you sitting down? I was sitting down. I was sitting at my son's dinner table, watching his face. That's wonderful news, Priya, I said, calm as Sunday morning. Thank you for telling me. Let's go through the numbers Monday. I'm at my son's just now. He's been telling everyone about my little craft thing. A small silence on the line. Priya knows me. Is he? She said, in a different voice. Well, you enjoy your dinner, Faye, and congratulations. You've earned every cent of this and then some. I said goodnight, and I set the phone back down, face up, on the table. The laughing had stopped. You could have heard a pin drop into wool. Glenn was looking at me with an entirely new expression. Ashley's father had set down his fork. Diane was staring at my phone as though it might bite her. And Trevor. Trevor had gone. The specific shade of grey a man turns when the floor he was standing on so confidently has just been revealed to be a trapdoor, and he is still falling. And he has not yet hit the bottom, and the worst part is that everyone watched him fall. "Mom," he said. His voice had gone strange. What was that about?" "That was Priya Anand," I said pleasantly. picking the bread back up. She owns Marigold House. She's been brokering a licensing deal between Carter and Hearth. That's my little craft thing. Deer and Hartwell's department stores. It sounds as though it went through. I buttered the bread. 40 stores, she said. It's a rather large number. I'll know the exact figure Monday, but it's the kind of figure that doesn't fit in a shoebox. I looked at him, not unkindly. I'd have told you all about it if you'd asked. You've never once asked. Glenn, to his enormous credit, started to laugh, a real laugh, delighted, the laugh of a man who has just watched something extraordinary happen. Faye, he said, Carter and Hearth is yours. My wife has 2 of your quilts. She's been on the waiting list for a 3rd for a year. There. He turned to Trevor, genuinely puzzled. Trevor, your mother runs Carter and Hearth, and you didn't lead with that. Son, that's the most impressive thing anyone at this table has said all night. I will remember Trevor's face for the rest of my life. Not with cruelty, with grief, honestly. Because that was the moment my son understood that he had spent years being ashamed of the one thing in his family that anyone in that room actually admired. And he'd announced his shame out loud to his boss at his own table 30 seconds before the truth walked in and sat down. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. The dinner limped on for another half hour, the conversation carefully steered by Glenn toward my quilts, toward the deal, toward me and every kind. Curious question Glenn asked was another small stone laid on the grave of Trevor's evening. Ashley said, almost nothing. Diane asked, in a careful new voice, whether the napkins were from the actual collection, and I said yes, they were, and she quietly moved them off the side table and into her handbag, and I let her, and I said nothing. And the saying nothing was its own small justice. I went home that night, and I did not gloat, and I did not cry. I made myself a cup of tea, and I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Carter and Hearth was born 31 years ago, and I took out the small notebook I keep in my work bag, the one Hal gave me, and I wrote a single line in it. I'd started doing that years ago, writing one true line on the nights that needed marking. I wrote, "A thing made by hand carries the maker's name, whether she brags about it or not." Then I closed the notebook, and I drank my tea, and underneath the hurt, something had gone very calm and very certain. The way the surface of water goes still, and you can suddenly see all the way to the bottom. Because the call hadn't just embarrassed my son, the call had clarified everything. For 2 years, I'd let myself half believe Trevor's campaign to wind down the business was clumsy love. I knew better now. A man who is ashamed of a thing does not get to inherit it. A man who calls your life's work embarrassing in front of his boss does not get handed the keys to it when you're gone. And the deal. Priya had just closed. The deal that was about to make Carter and Hearth worth more than I'd ever dreamed. Meant I had a great many decisions to make very soon, about where all of it would go. I'd been putting those decisions off, the way you do, telling myself there was time, telling myself my son would come around. He wasn't going to come around. He'd just told a table full of strangers exactly who he was. So somewhere over that cup of tea, I stopped being a mother, hoping her son would grow up, and I started being a businesswoman, deciding what to do with a company. Hal would have understood the difference. He'd spent years getting me ready for exactly this, though neither of us ever said so. The next morning, I called 3 people. Not Trevor, I called Priya to tell her yes and to set the meeting. I called Marcus, my accountant, and asked him to pull together the full valuation, the building, the company, the value of the licensing deal, all of it, on one clean page. And I called a woman named Ruth Okafor, an estate attorney Hal and I had used years ago, and I told her I needed to come in and put my affairs in order properly, because everything had changed, and I needed it locked down in a way that no amount of gentle concern at a dinner table could ever bend. Before I tell you what I did in Ruth's office, you should understand what was happening on the other side of town, because Trevor did not stay quiet for long. Quiet men rarely do once the shock wears off and the math sets in. The calls started 2 days later. Not apologies. I want to be precise about that, because it matters for everything I decided. Trevor did not call to say he was sorry he'd humiliated me. Trevor called to manage the asset. Mom, he said, in a bright, careful voice I knew too well. I had no idea things had gotten so big with the business. That's amazing, truly. Listen, we should really sit down and talk about, planning, estate stuff, making sure everything's set up smart, tax-wise. Ashley's dad knows a great wealth guy, we could all, and there it was. Not how could I have hurt you, Mom, not I'm so ashamed. Just, now that the embarrassing little hobby turns out to be worth something, let's make sure it flows to the right people. Me. Let's make sure it flows to me. I'd watched this happen once before, years ago, to a friend of mine whose son discovered the value of her house at roughly the speed of light the moment her health declined. The concern arrives precisely calibrated to the size of the asset. Trevor had called my business embarrassing on Friday and called it amazing on Sunday, and the only thing that had changed in between was the number. I told him we'd talk soon. I had no intention of talking soon. I had a deal to sign and an estate to lock first, because I'd learned from Hal that you put the paperwork in order before you have the conversation, not after. You don't announce your decision and then go build the wall. You build the wall, quietly, and then you tell people where the door is. Ruth Okafor is 70 and does not suffer fools. I sat in her office with Marcus's one clean page in front of me, and I'll tell you the number on it now, because you've waited as patiently as I had to. Between the paid-off building on Lyle Street, the company itself, the inventory and the trademark, and the licensing deal Priya had just closed with Hartwell's, Carter and Hearth and its assets were worth a little over $2 million. $2 million, built one stitch at a time, by a woman her son was trying to talk into quitting before it got embarrassing. Ruth read the page, read the situation. I told her about the dinner, about the Wind It Down campaign, about the Sunday phone call where amazing replaced embarrassing, and she set down her pen. So, she said, your son spent 2 years trying to get you to liquidate an asset he thought was worthless, to bail himself out of debt he hasn't told you about. And now that he knows it's worth $2 million, he'd like to help you plan your estate. She almost smiled. Let's make sure your estate plans itself, then, without his help. And we did. I'll tell you exactly what I built, because the building of it is the heart of this. First, the company. Carter and Hearth was my life's work, and I was not going to let it die with me, or, worse, be sold off for parts by a son who thought it was embarrassing. So I restructured it. The 2 women who'd stitched beside me for years, Lorraine and Patty, were given a real ownership stake. They'd built this with me, and they would carry it forward. The young woman who ran the website, Danny, got a stake too. And I set the whole thing up so that, when I'm gone, the company passes to the people who actually make it, held together by a structure Ruth designed so that no one can sell it out from under them. Second, Emma, my granddaughter, 10 years old, who calls my workshop the magic place. The bulk of the value, the building, the proceeds from the licensing deal as they come in, went into a trust for Emma, not for Trevor, not for Ashley. A locked education and future trust, administered independently, that her parents cannot spend, borrow against, or touch. For Emma's schooling and her start in life. And, written into it, because I am sentimental and because Hal would have loved it, a provision that Emma may, if she wishes, apprentice at Carter and Hearth when she's grown, and learn the work, and someday hold a piece of the company she loved before she knew it was worth anything. The child who asked how a quilt is made, instead of how much it costs, will inherit the knowing. That's the real fortune. The money is just the frame around it. Third, the wall. Everything, the company restructuring, the trust, a new will, a power of attorney, a healthcare directive, locked down tight, witnessed, notarized, with Ruth and my own sister Carol named to stand for me if I ever can't stand for myself. Not Trevor. I want to be honest that this cost me something. He's my son. There was a version of my life where Trevor stood at my shoulder at the end, and I closed the door on that version myself, in a lawyer's office, with a steady hand, because he'd shown me at his own dinner table exactly how much my trust was worth to him. Sometimes the most loving thing a mother can do is refuse to hand her child a thing he's already shown her he'll throw away. It took about 3 weeks to build, partly because the Hartwell's deal was closing at the same time, and I was, for the first time in my life, a woman signing a contract worth more than her house. I signed it in Priya's office with my reading glasses on, and Hal's voice in my head, price it like it's worth something. Faye. And when the pen came up off the paper, I sat for a moment and let myself feel him there, the man who'd spent years quietly insisting I was worth more than I believed. Finally, undeniably proven right. Then, and only then, when the wall was built and the door was where I wanted it, I called my son and invited him and Ashley to dinner. At my house this time, my table, the one where all of it began. I'll tell you why I did it that way, with everyone in a room, instead of letting the lawyers handle it cold. Because Trevor had mocked me in public, in front of an audience, and I'd decided the truth deserved an audience too, not a cruel one, a small, honest one. I invited my sister Carol, who'd loved me through all of it. I invited Priya, because she was family now, in the way that people who see your worth become family. And I invited Trevor and Ashley, and I made a roast, because some weapons are kindness. They came wary. Trevor had been calling all week about planning, and I think he believed this dinner was where I'd finally let him steer me toward Ashley's father's wealth guy. Ashley wore the careful, polished look of a woman who'd decided to be very gracious about her mother-in-law's sudden good fortune. We ate first, I insisted. You don't do the hard thing on an empty stomach. And I wanted no one able to say afterward they'd been ambushed. Then I cleared the plates, and I sat back down, and I set a folder on the table, and I rested my hand flat on it. Trevor, I said, a few weeks ago, at your table, you held up my work in front of your boss and called it a little craft thing you were trying to get me to wind down before it got embarrassing. And then Priya called. I let that sit. I'd like to show you tonight what you were actually mocking. Because I don't think you've ever once looked at it, and I think it's time you did. I opened the folder, and I laid the pages out one at a time, slow and deliberate, the way a banker counts out a fortune, which is exactly what I was doing. This is the company, I said, setting down the first page. Carter and Hearth. 31 years. 4 employees besides me. 9 stores in 3 states. A trademark your father insisted we file because he believed in my work even when I wasn't sure I did. I set down the next page. This is the building on Lyle Street. The one you kept telling me to sell. I own it outright. It's worth more now than the house you're so proud of, and there's no mortgage on it. Because I don't buy things I can't pay for. Trevor flinched at that, and I let him. And this, I said, laying down Marcus's clean page, is what the whole thing is worth now that the Hartwell's deal has closed. Go ahead. Read the number. He read it. I watched the number go into him. 2 million and change. Ashley made a small sound. Trevor's mouth opened and closed. That's the embarrassing little craft thing, I said gently. That's the sewing circle stuff you waggled your hand at. I want you to sit with the fact that you spent 2 years trying to talk me into liquidating that, and calling it concern, while you were quietly drowning in payments you've never had the courage to tell me about. His head came up sharply. Oh, I know about the house, Trevor, and the cars. A mother knows when her son is frightened, even when he's being cruel to hide it. Especially then. And then Trevor did what frightened people do. He reached instantly for the version where he was the wronged party. You let me, he said, his voice climbing. You let me sit there for years thinking it was just a hobby. You never told me how big it had gotten. If you'd known it was worth 2 million, you wouldn't have mocked it. I finished for him, still calm. Yes. That's rather the whole problem, isn't it? You didn't need to know the number to be kind to your mother. You needed the number to decide whether I was worth respecting. That's not something I did to you, Trevor. That's something you just told a whole table about yourself. I folded my hands. I never hid my business from you. You never asked. In 31 years, you never once asked me how a quilt was made, or how the company was doing, or whether I was proud of it. Your daughter asked. Emma asks every Saturday. You were too embarrassed to be curious. Ashley started to say something. Something about how stressful things had been, how I couldn't possibly understand the pressure they were under. And I turned to her, just once, and I said, Ashley, I understand pressure. I built a $2 million company through a recession and a widowhood with these hands. What I've never done is take that pressure out on someone who loved me and call it concern. You taught my son a great deal about appearances. I'd sit this part out. And she sat it out. Then I told them what came next, because mercy and consequence can sit at the same table, and I'd raised Trevor once, before the world got to him to know the difference. Here is what happens now, I said. Carter and Hearth, when I'm gone, goes to the people who actually make it. Lorraine and Patty and Danny, who've never once been embarrassed by it. The building and the bulk of the value go into a trust, not for you, for Emma. Trevor went very still. It's locked, for her education and her start in life. You can't spend it, borrow against it, or touch it, and it has a place in it for her to learn the work someday, if she wants to, because she's the only one in your house who ever loved the work instead of the price of it. I softened, because I'm not cruel. I'm not doing this to punish you, Trevor. I'm doing it because that child is going to grow up in a house that taught her worth is a number on a tag, and someday she's going to need to know there was another way to measure things. Her grandfather knew it. I know it. She's going to learn it from us, even after I'm gone. And the debt? Trevor's voice was very small now. The house. He stopped. He'd never said it out loud before. Mum, we're really underwater. And here is where the story turns one more time, because this is the part people get wrong about what they call revenge. I did not say no to my son. I am not built to watch my child drown to prove a point. But I did not say yes the way he wanted, either. I'm not going to hand you money to keep pretending, I said. Pulling you out of this pool one more time is exactly how we got here. But I'll do this. I'll sit down with you and Marcus, my accountant, not Ashley's father's wealth guy, and we'll look at the real numbers, the true ones, and we'll make a plan to get you out from under it the honest way. You'll sell the house you can't afford. You'll give back a car. You'll live like people who make what you actually make. And I'll help you do it with dignity, as your mother, because I love you. What I won't do is fund the lie that got you into it. The lie is over. That's the help. It's the only help worth giving. Trevor put his face in his hands. And for the first time since he was a boy, my son cried in front of me, not the performing kind, the real kind. The kind that comes when a man finally stops holding up something too heavy to hold. I'm so ashamed, he said. Not of you, Mum, of me. I was ashamed of the best person I know. I let him cry. Sometimes that's the whole job of being a mother. You let them cry, and you don't rush it, and you don't fix it too fast. Here's how it shook out in the months after, because I know you want the ledger, and not just the feeling. The Hartwell's deal launched in the autumn, and Carter and Hearth quilts went into 40 stores across the country, with my name, Hal's name, our name on every label. There's a waiting list now you wouldn't believe. Lorraine and Patty hired 2 more stitchers. Danny redid the website and we cannot keep the holiday collection in stock. The shoebox is a very distant memory. Hal would have been insufferable about it, and I would have loved every minute of his insufferability. The trust for Emma is locked and growing, doing quietly for my granddaughter exactly what it should, waiting patiently, the way good things wait. She still comes on Saturdays. She knows now, a little, that the magic place turned out to be worth something. But to her credit and to my relief, she still asks how, not how much. Last month, she finished her first full quilt, small, lopsided, gorgeous, and she signed the corner the way I taught her, with a tiny embroidered initial, and I had to go into the back room for a minute so she wouldn't see her grandmother cry. Ashley and I will never be close. I've made my peace with that. For a long while, she stayed exactly who she'd been at that table, cool and careful, and quietly furious that the woman she'd looked through had turned out to matter. But people are slow, not fixed. A few months ago, she asked me stiffly, like the words cost her, if I'd teach her to make something for Emma's birthday. We made a small, embroidered pillow together. She wasn't good at it. She didn't throw it away. It's a start. Trevor is the one who changed the most. Shame did to him what 40 years of comfort never could. He sold the house. He gave back the leased car. He and Ashley moved into something they can actually afford. And the strangest thing happened. Trevor told me he sleeps better now than he has in years. We meet with Marcus monthly. He's climbing out of the debt the honest way, slow and real. And a few weeks ago, he came by the workshop on a Saturday, which he had not done since he was a boy, and he sat at Emma's little table, and he asked me finally, at 34, to show him how a quilt is made. I showed him. His hands are clumsy at it, like his father's were. We sat there a long time, the three of us, Emma and Trevor and me, stitching badly and well, and I thought, there it is, the inheritance, not the 2 million. This. People ask me sometimes whether I was too hard on him, locking the trust, refusing the money, making him sell the house. Couldn't I have just forgiven him and helped? I did forgive him. Forgiveness and consequence are not opposites. They sat at my table at the very same time. Forgiving my son didn't mean handing him the keys to a thing he'd shown me he didn't value. It meant loving him enough to make him face the truth, and then standing beside him while he did. The cruelty at that dinner wasn't the worst thing he ever did. The worst thing was all the years of quiet shame that led up to it. But the dinner was the one I couldn't unsee, and thank God for it, because it's what finally made him look. If there's one thing I'd hand you from all of this, it's this. The world will tell you, louder every year, that the worth of a thing, a quilt, a craft, a person, is the number someone else is willing to put on it. Don't you believe it? The most valuable things in any room are almost always the quiet ones, made by hand, built one patient, year at a time, by someone who was told it was just a little hobby. Worth doesn't wait for permission to exist. It was always there, in the work and in the maker, long before any store owner ever called to confirm it. Make your thing. Make it well. And never, ever let anyone, not even the children you'd lie down in traffic for, tell you that the work of your hands belongs in the trash. That's my story. One dinner, one phone call, one folder laid out on a table, and a craft they called embarrassing that turned out to be worth more than all their appearances combined. Sometimes dignity does not arrive with shouting. Sometimes it just answers the phone at the dinner table and lets the truth introduce itself. If it reminded you of something you make with your own hands, something they told you was just a hobby, I hope you'll go make a little more of it this week. Drop a comment, tell me where you're listening from, hit subscribe, and I'll see you next time.